wabarakatuh. In today's uh, chapter or in today's video, in this continued series discussing the various aspects, the various facets of Islamophobia, I would like to do two things. One is that I would like to, of course, we would like to talk a little bit about what Islamophobia is and isn't, but I feel like there is a fair amount of attention that has been given to this topic. Instead, I would like to argue that in order to contest Islamophobia, in order to oppose it, in order to even fight it, one needs to have an accurate understanding of history. Because it is the lack of understanding of history which often makes us incapable of truly understanding what demonizes us, what criminalizes us. And Islamophobia is no exception to this case. The second thing that I would like to do is to speak from my location, my geographical location or positionality as a research scholar in a central university. In a central university that lays claim to being secular or inclusive or progressive. So, therefore, one of course would be the broader context of Islamophobia. Um, Particularly rooted in the incidents that surround us, and the other is, of course, something something that is emerging, an emerging conversation from the field of Muslims in higher education, Muslim students in higher education, and what this means for the discourse of Islamophobia, and whether experiences of Muslim students in higher education can be accurately understood through this prism. And to begin with the first thing, the reason I choose to historicize the understanding of Islamophobia is not to historicize the use of the term, um, because the term can be as old as 100 years, or it can be recent, or it can find lack of application in different countries, such as different definitions, which do not fit in very well with different contexts. So rather than spending a lot of time on what Islamophobia is and what it isn't, and whether it is a phobia, whether it is an irrational fear, whether it is the fear of Muslims or of Islam or of both, which is a debate that we often get caught up in, which is an important debate. Necessarily, it is an important debate because one must understand what one is talking about. But uh, perhaps starting with the working definition of Islamophobia, the working definition that I have recently come across, that is quite interesting and relevant to our context, I feel, is the tripartite Islamophobia scale, which scholars Siranius Berg et al. Have worked on in 2020 itself. It's a new paper where they argue that for them it is necessary to do this study because Islamophobia does not, many of the existing definitions of Islamophobia might not be translatable across countries and contexts, such as an emphasis on race might not work in a different context, such as an emphasis on migrants might not work in another context. So instead, they have looked at three factors: anti Muslim prejudice, anti Islamic sentiment, and conspiracy beliefs. And I find this very interesting because anti Muslim prejudice is, of course, clear to us, because the various values or the way or lack thereof that are attributed to Muslims, such as untrustworthiness, irrationality, anger, violence, so on and so forth. That is one aspect of it. The other is, of course, beliefs, wrongly held beliefs about Islam, such as that it's intrinsically sexist, that it is anti-Semitic, that it is violent, and most interestingly, like some of the recent work that has come in on Islam and modernity, that Islam as a religion is incompatible with modernity, and the third being conspiracy beliefs, which is what I choose to begin with, because if we look around us, there are a lot of conspiracy theories that are perpetuated about Islam and Muslims in the Indian context, and then they are used to enact not just large scale violence or large scale pogroms, but also to humiliate, degrade, or insult or alienate individual Muslims, such as conspiracy beliefs such as love jihad or population myths. Um, these kind of conversations, these kind of narratives, they're like snowballs. They grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they can be used in different ways by different people. And this is where the importance of history comes in, because Islamophobia, um, in these forms of love jihad or of the population myth, are often read to be products of post 1990s and post 9/11, for instance. But that is not true. Many of these, even the cartoon controversies, for instance, are seen in a very recent light. But many of these have a long history. And one of the most interesting questions that I find that has a long history is that of loyalty. Um, of course, there is an awareness today that the question of loyalty is a burden that has been put on Muslims in India, such as particularly manifested, I think, in the CA and RC debates, is a very well articulated by many people. Um, but the questions of loyalty are not just limited to independent India. They go back very long in history to Muslims as a community who are seen either as incapable of being loyal to their country as a sovereign because they are instead overtly loyal to their faith, or as a community which inherently finds its source of loyalty in a different nation. And this is something that manifests in very real terms in how the CA and NRC work, for instance. Now, Islamophobia, therefore, the reason I have, dragged out this introduction is because to understand or to explain that Islamophobia can be a very insidious thing. It doesn't necessarily look like an event or an act. It can also be a long, slow burning, and subtle process. Because while our attention is grabbed by the spectacle, by incidents of spectacular violence, we often miss out on the smaller stories. And that is why the space of the university, particularly the space of the secular university, is a very interesting field to look at. And I say this secular university particularly, of course, in quotes, because I think it's no longer an unknown subject that the university has been a very complicated space for Muslim students, researchers, younger students across that age, barrier. Of course, it manifests in different ways. It manifests differently for Muslim women. It would manifest differently from people of different ethnicities or castes or races or of religions. But there should be an understanding now that the university is a very important space of study, important space to understand how education does not necessarily challenge societal stratification or hierarchies, but often replicates them. And the Indian University, I study in JNU, I am doing my PhD in JNU, and so it has been a few years there. But also other universities such as HCU, such as IFLU, many other spaces, and I'm focusing particularly on the Central University. This does not mean that other arenas of higher education, whether it is medical education or technical education or state universities, do not have these does not have this current or flow of Islamophobia going through them. Of course they do, and they all manifest in unique ways. Particularly, for example, medical education is a field that has seen a lot of conversation around discrimination in different forms, such as caste, such as religion. Uh, but the interesting thing about Islamophobia in the Central University, in this so called progressive secular Central University, is that Islamophobia functions not only through violence but also through the power of silence, also through the power of how to train or how to shape the minds of Muslim students in a way that they do not have the courage to enunciate their anxieties, do not have the courage to enunciate their experiences. And this fear is carefully inculcated into the minds of Muslim students who come to these spaces, to the point where Islamophobia itself becomes taboo. It frequently has been said about race, for instance, that the person who invokes the feeling of being discriminated against for his or her race is held responsible for making a space uncomfortable, for invoking the specter of race. Similarly, with Islamophobia, it is almost that if Muslim students in university spaces that are otherwise seen as breaking down hierarchies, that are otherwise seen as spaces where students intermingle irrespective of the differences, if Muslim students in these spaces name their experiences, they are seen as almost betraying the consensus in the university, the consensus of silence, and the consensus of progress. And the university that I come from is no exception. But it has also been the stories that have emerged out of other universities, such as the incident of Fatima Latif's institutional murder, the incident in IFLU, where Mudassir Kamran, a Kashmiri student, was not, forget defending a student, he was instead handed over to the police. In such a state, what would it mean to hand over a Kashmiri student to the police, very well knowing this? That is what the university administration in IFLU did, and that is what caused the death of a student like Mudassir Kamran. And of course, coming to JNU and the incident of Najib Ahmed is something that everybody might know down to the finest detail of it. But what does it mean for Muslim students to enunciate not just these experiences, these very explicit experiences of Islamophobia? Even these experiences are not allowed to be named. That is another factor altogether, that even Muslim students are not allowed to say the fact, were not allowed to say the fact that Najib, for example, was beaten up because of his Muslim identity. That is another factor altogether. But there is another layer below all of this, where Islamophobia is like a silent stalking, specter, where people might have to self-censor, people might have to think 10 times about what they do or what they say or what they present on in their academic spaces. With the smallest things like titles of PhD dissertations might have to be changed because they appear too quote-unquote communal, where there are stray remarks at mess tables, so on and so forth. And the response invariably to things like this is either do these things still happen, or complete denial that these things cannot happen. And this silencing is something that has been broken through in many central universities. And it is this precise breaking through, it is this naming, the act of taking back the discourse for yourself, and the act of the power of telling the world what has happened to you, what has happened to people like you in the past, and what can happen to people like you in the future. This act of naming has what has shaken up the university in the past few years. And this is precisely a microcosm of the broader picture. We are often very disturbed by Islamophobia. We are disturbed by, mentally disturbed, physically disturbed by the fact that Muslims can be killed with such impunity, they can be discriminated against with such impunity. But it is also a fact that the more Islam is accepted as truth, Islamophobia is only a method to counter this acceptance. It's a method to put fear in the hearts of the people who might be able to see the truth. And therefore, Islamophobia is also a response in Indian universities of Muslims not just increasing in number, I will come to that, but also increasing in terms of discourse. The question of increasing in number is very important because Muslims have been traditionally denied access to higher education, and it is only in the last few years where they have managed to claw their way into the university structure. And this act of clawing has meant that there are more such students in universities who can now not just research, not just study, not just use education as a tool to get further in life, but also more students who can name what is being done to their community. So numbers matter. And what do numbers do? They, of course, one classic response to this is, of course, the way the population myth works at the macro level. It also works in universities. There are comments made by faculty, even very progressive faculty in JNU would say that, who have said that, oh, a few years ago there were no such women who used to observe hijab. Now there are modern young women who do it. It's almost the visibility, the presence itself is a very disturbing factor. But what is more disturbing than the mere presence is also what Muslim students are saying, and or what they are doing, or how they are coming together. And so Islamophobia can be understood. Again, this old debate of whether Islamophobia can be understood as something that is carried out against Muslims or something that is carried out against Islam also finds its play in the university space itself, where it's not just Muslim students which sparks off a wave of anger or distress or being disturbed, but it's also the fact that there are many Muslim students in universities who are willing to stick to their faith, who are willing to speak about their faith, who are willing to discuss it, and therefore it is clearly a combination of the both. So Islamophobia is not functioning only against Muslims or only against Islam, but it really finds its root when it finds Muslims who are practicing their faith with an openness that they cannot tolerate. And the reason I have put out this map of the Central University in front of you, of one Central University, I think it would be very important that these voices come from different spaces, knowing their different contexts, because Islamophobia is not something to only be very anxious about. It is something that we have to solve. It is something that we have to work on or work against, to diffuse, to put an end to. And very often, this kind of work, this kind of very difficult work, is seen as a responsibility that we might not want to take on because it's a very difficult job. Because sometimes we say that, look, it's not my job to explain why something is wrong. It's not my job to do this labor. But the truth is that there is a model in front of us, and that is the prophetic model in front of us. And the response to Islamophobia also has to be steeped in that tradition. There is a need for us to bring together various avenues of responses to Islamophobia, and that holds true within the university space as well. Of course, there are ways to reach out to people who may not necessarily understand what you are saying or the faith you follow. And the importance of doing this does not mean a sense of apologia. This line has to be demarcated. Apologia would mean that you are ashamed of what you are, and you therefore feel a sense to um, explain it in a way that does not offend the other person. Instead, the difficult work of putting an end to Islamophobia is a responsibility that we have. And this responsibility can work in different ways, whether it is the legal, or in terms of education, or political, or in terms of resistance in different forms. And in the central university, in the university spaces where there has been absolute silence so far, where there has even been outright violence, such as in JNU, where the students from ABVP and outside attacked. They did not just attack randomly; they also attacked and targeted particularly Muslim students and Kashmiri students. So when there has been such a strong wave of Islamophobia in so many campuses, it is important to know that the presence of Muslim students in higher education is only one step, but it is a very important step. The more of us who are willing to speak up, the more of us who are willing to do this hard work, also means that there are more people who would have the courage, who would have this little seed of courage within them to enter into these spaces and find a place for themselves to study, to work, to research, to think, and to produce more knowledge on not just what Islamophobia is and isn't, but also on their own communities, their own histories, and their own spaces. So this is not what I have said today is not a very traditional understanding of what Islamophobia is, its origins, its source, and so on and so forth. It's almost anecdotal in nature. But it's important to understand, because I feel that in my experience and the experience of so many students, Islamophobia has often been understood. Unfortunately, Muslims in Indian academia have only been reduced to either as characters as part of large scale communal violence, or their backwardness has been studied, but their own stories, their own presence, their own narratives are completely absent, and their own voices are completely absent from the space of the academia. And that itself is a form of Islamophobia. It can be called epistemic Islamophobia, where a community's knowledge systems are erased and silenced. And that epistemic Islamophobia is one aspect that we have to challenge in our work and life. So I think that we need to look around in our context and try to see the work that has to be done. It doesn't have to be only a singular context, whether it is the campus, whether it is the space of the neighborhood, whether it is media, whether it is any such field that we have some kind of alignment to. We need to realize that there is a lot of work to be done, and the university is one such space. For those of us who are students, for those of us who are researchers, it often feels very difficult, and it is very difficult. It is very, very difficult in a space where there is an immense power dynamic between you and your supervisor, between you and your other faculty, between the fact that literally your education is in their hands. It can feel very difficult to outrightly do something or name something or go out of your way to resist. So it is not our job to be discouraged that perhaps the problems are too big for us. Because like I said, there is already a model that we have to follow, that we can learn from, that we have learned from, but perhaps we have forgotten how to apply it, that model in our small and everyday spaces. So with that, I think I would like to conclude with this remembrance, with this perhaps this note that for the many people, for the many students whom Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred or that kind of discrimination has pushed out of the university, whether physically or just by closing its gates, there have been many others who have struggled to enter it as well. And it is our duty, it is our responsibility to take that up and to ensure that Islamophobia is not the weapon that replicates that cycle of pushing out, of exclusion, and of discrimination.